Okay, let's get started. Good evening. I'm Janet Gornick, Professor of Political Science and Sociology here at the Graduate Center, the doctoral granting campus of the City University of New York. I'm also director of the Stone Center on Socio-Economic Inequality, and I'm also a co-founder of the Lee Rainwater Memorial Lecture Series, and wearing all of those hats, it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. So let me first tell you how the evening will unfold. I'm going to speak for about 5 minutes, mainly to give some background about the lecture series, and then I'm going to turn the podium over to Tim Smeating, the other founder of this series, and I've asked him to talk to you all about Lee Rainwater and to briefly introduce Kathryn Edin, and I've given him 5 minutes to do both of those. And that's clearly ridiculous because both Lee and Kathy have long, remarkable careers, and because I know that Tim admires them both enormously, but I'm sure he'll comply because we're all eager to get to the main event. After Tim's remarks, Kathy will deliver her lecture, The Tenuous Ties of Working Class Men, speaking for about 45 minutes, and then we'll follow that with an audience Q&A. And at that point, we'll invite people with questions to line up at the microphones in the aisle to make sure that their questions are recorded because we're live streaming, and we'll also have a subsequent video. And I'm tasked with pulling down the curtain at 7:45. Let me go back in time to 1983. Lee Rainwater, collaborating with a group of social scientists from 6 countries, dreamed up the idea of the Luxembourg Income Study, known as LIS, with which many of you are familiar. LIS is a cross-national data archive located in Luxembourg, and its mission is, and has been from the beginning, to produce high-quality cross-national microdata, that's data at the level of households and persons, and to make those data available to researchers to carry out scholarship on poverty, inequality, and other socioeconomic outcomes. While many people contributed to the birth of LIS, Lee was, by all accounts, its intellectual godfather. In 1983, Lee was 55 years old, and in his later years, he was fond of saying back then that he thought he was too old to be the person tasked with actually creating LIS, getting it funded, housed, staffed, and launched. So as he also liked to recall, he went in search of a, quote, young genius, ideally an economist, just crazy enough to pull up stakes, move to Luxembourg, and build LIS. LIS lore is that Lee queried the U.S. community of poverty and social policy scholars seeking nominations. 2 people, one of them being Irv Garfinkel, who just arrived, said, well, clearly that would be Tim's meeting. And indeed, Lee approached Tim, who accepted the challenge and moved to Luxembourg. And Tim went on to serve as director of LIS for 23 years, working side by side with Lee throughout those years. Lee took the title of LIS Research Director, which was a fine title, but one that obscures the fact that he spent thousands of hours with his hands deep in the data. And he also led the technological innovations that allowed LIS to share its protected data sets with researchers all over the world. The amazingly forward-looking technological framework that Lee imagined in the 1980s remains in place today. So fast forward to 1989, I was a PhD student at Harvard working as Lee's teaching assistant, and 2 weeks into the term, Lee asked if I would be willing to join the LIS staff to design and build a social policy database to complement the microdata. I confess that my first thought was, as Tim's had been 6 years earlier, where on earth is Luxembourg? Fortunately, I had an atlas. That was before Google Maps, and that quickly settled the mystery. I was disappointed when I realized that Luxembourg was not in the Alps. That was Liechtenstein. But nevertheless, I too got on a plane and I moved to Luxembourg, where Tim and Lee retrieved me from the tiny airport. I immediately found the cross-national work to be absolutely electrifying, and like Tim, I got hooked, and my 1-year stint at LIS turned into 30 years. For the first 15 of those years, I had a front row seat watching Lee and Tim build LIS, and at the same time create an immense body of influential cross-national research, and it was an invaluable learning opportunity for which I'll always be grateful, and I also had the privilege of being Lee's final dissertation advisee. When Lee died in 2015, Tim and I decided to found a lecture series in Lee's name. We approached his family, and they were pleased with that. Within weeks, Lee's family and several friends and colleagues generously contributed, and we're now nearly set to hold the series in perpetuity. The venue will alternate annually between Harvard and here, the CUNY Graduate Center. Tonight's lecture, the second one, is of course then the first held in New York City, and we're immensely delighted to have Lee's family here with us this evening. In the audience, Lee's wife, Carol, Rainwater, their daughter Kathryn Rainwater, their son John Rainwater, and their daughter-in-law Susan Stevenson, and we also have many of the donors here as well. When we designed the series, we set parameters. This lecture series will aim to highlight new research within the many substantive areas where Lee made profound intellectual contributions, including poverty, inequality, urban culture, and social policy. And the topics will span both U.S. and cross-national studies. To honor Lee's remarkable career trajectory, the series will include scholars using a mix of methods, and we'll draw speakers from multiple disciplines. In short, we made a commitment to invite speakers whose work captures all of Lee, from his early ethnographic work through his later quantitative comparative scholarship. Once we were established, I sent an email to the donors and asked them to nominate potential speakers. Several suggested Robert Erickson, who helped to found LIS, and he gave the inaugural lecture. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that one of the initial supporters of the Lee Rainwater Memorial Lecture Series was the great British economist, Tony Atkinson, who was then LIS's board president, a position that he held until his death last year. Tony suggested Kathy Edin. And that speaks, of course, to the breadth of Tony's interest, but it's also a testament to Kathy and her decades-long capacity to attract and influence readers well beyond the borders of sociology. So now I turn the stage over to Tim, who currently serves as the Lee Rainwater Distinguished Professor of Public Affairs and Economics at the University of Wisconsin. I might note that earlier today, Tim sent me a PowerPoint that he's going to use and instructed me not to look at it. That tells me that something colorful may be coming. I don't know. Tim, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. You'll see in a minute. There we go. Does that work? Oh, there it is. I have been charged with doing a few things, and so that's the cover slide. Oh, excuse me. She reminds me of that too. So this was the script I was given. Tim. And you know, if you've ever got an email from Janet, it's capitals, it's yellow underline, it's the whole 9 yards. Reiterate how grateful we are to the donors. We're very grateful to the donors. Thank you very much for supporting the series and honoring Lee in this way. Mention that we're excited, and we were, the selection committee, the donors chose the great Swedish sociologist Robert Erickson last year. That's the international part. And we're equally delighted when Kathy was chosen to give the second lecture this year at CUNY. And the last thing is, don't throw any water bottles at Carol this year. Last year I threw a water bottle. I was throwing it to Sandy Jenks, and it hit Carol. But what? She's going to throw it back this year. Now I can do my own intro. That's what I was supposed to do. Okay. Lee is a friend, mentor, co-author, father figure. We're 20 years different, so when I was 35 to I was 55, I lost my father in 88. And from day one, he was there, and if you want to know my opinion of Lee and what he contributed, even beyond what Janet said, you can just look at the YouTube that Janet's partner Dan actually did for us, which is sort of the history of LIS. And it was my major accomplishment, but Lee had lots of them, so that's what we're here to talk about. Lee was an economic sociologist. He and Sandy Jenks were referred to at the point as they're really economists, they're not sociologists. But the thing was that Lee knew numbers really well and could easily translate them in ways that people could understand them. So between he and I, we invented the square root equivalence scale that's got 2,500 sites on Google, because it's just a way to adjust for family size. It's really simple that everyone understands. That was one. He was also a great writer, to my great benefit. He introduced me to Pat Moynihan, and I got to know Liz and Maura, who's here somewhere, I think. Maura, you out there? Not yet. Your friend Marcy's in the front row here. They're old pals too, okay? And that allowed me to get to know them and to reconnect with some old friends. But what today is about is before LIS and before the number crunching, there was Lee the ethnographer. And that's part that I had to learn, and I did learn about it from a lot of people, and I'll say something more about it. Anyway, this was a classic. This was the LIS boys. This is Tony Atkinson, Lee, and I in a wine cellar somewhere in Europe where we're writing the OECD study on income distribution. I was the skinny one in the middle, but I mean, the brains on either side of me, you know, you say we stand on shoulders of giants, there they were. I miss them and admire both of them very, very much. So, now Lee the ethnographer. Now, no one can find Lee's CV. I had one way, way, way back, and we could never find one. Luckily, there's something, Carol, called Google Scholar. And Lee didn't have a Google Scholar account. I remembered a lot of them. I got a lot of the sites, and dang, look what came out. Look at all this stuff. And the poor get children, the meaning of color, the crucible of identity, the Negro lower class family, the Moynihan Report, and the politics of controversy with Yancey. Behind Ghetto Walls, which is an absolute classic that's cited everywhere, Soul, and then What Money Buys. So this is the Lee Rainwater that many of you don't know. And so I asked somebody who did know and who did a number of reviews of this. So I asked Frank Furstenberg the other day, what should I say? And he wrote me the following. What you could say about Lee Rainwater's contribution to urban ethnography already exceeds by far the time allotted to your introduction and to Kathy's talk combined. Lee, in his wonderful volume on children and with his talented collaborators in St. Louis and then Chicago, the Chicago School, where he was with Carol, were part of a second generation of ethnographers who thrived in the post-war period. There was Lee, Herb Gans, who you know, who may even be here, Elliot Lebo, Carol Stack, among others, who really showed what it was like to be poor or in the working class, which is what Kathy has done since, so that she was the perfect person. And Frank says it's wonderful at Kathy. So Frank couldn't be here, but that just made it easy for me. Okay, now we can move on. Now, the script from the boss. Once again, then you'd close by introducing Kathy for 30 seconds. Nah, it's going to take a little longer than that. We've known each other too long, so that's the beginning. So from about 15 letters I've written, most in the last decade for Kathy at various universities, not all of which did she go to, we have the following. We've been friends and colleagues for 25 years. We met at Penn State in 1993. Sandy, her mentor, Jenks, sent her dissertation to me in 1991. We're co-members of the MacArthur Network and the Family, and I had the privilege to read and review It's Not Like I'm Poor and $2 a Day before they hit the presses. And we have a jointly authored paper which follows right after $2 a day for a child allowance for the United States, which is something that I believe in. And, you know, you get to be my age and you might as well believe in something and try and push that rather than, you know, what's the value of another article. So I really think we need something like that for kids in America. So, as many of you may or may not know, Kathy more or less invented the field of mixed methods in poverty research. Making Ends Meet was an incredible book with Laureline, followed from her thesis. And then even more influential follow-up, $2 a Day. Both of them were about how do you survive in a world where you haven't got enough money. One was when you got a check for welfare. Kathy said, how much do you spend, how much do you get, and figured out the difference. And this is $2 a Day with Luke Schaefer about there actually are people who live that way. Not all year long, no, but there are people, and Jonathan Mordock's data shows us again and again and again. So Kathy broke new ground on extreme poverty, on housing, on mobility, the ITC, the dignity of work, emergency saving plans, and more. And she's doing more every day. And all of this work is multidisciplinary, and it's got very clear policy implications. So this is just amazing. So, but now Kathy's in middle age. Not a kid anymore, Kat. The girls are off in school and, and so forth. So what you can say at the end is in the field of mixed methods, in the family life of the poor, she stands alone. No one else is her equal. No one. She's got a junior colleague who writes well named Desmond, but he's not in her shoes yet. Okay. She's a major mentor. She trained others like Laura Tock, my friend, and one-time co-author, Steph DeLuca, who's worked with her, Luke Schaefer, and my colleague Sarah Halpern-Meekin. Those are all budding stars, young associate professors and full professors, and now they're having their grandchildren. They're training the next generation to do the same thing. Kathy's a great speaker, recruiter, leader. I remember she says, Tim, you have to tell Matt Desmond to come to Harvard. Well, Matt Desmond's going to decide where he wants to go, but it worked out. And she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences at a very young age for those sorts of honors in 2014. And now she's influencing policymakers, writing bills, making policy-related presentations, and was a member of the Gates-funded U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, which had a lot of good idea, a lot of good juice, the first big Gates effort on domestic U.S. poverty. Of course, it hasn't gone anywhere yet. No one's going anywhere today, but I'm hoping it has legs. So enough. With that, I want to introduce Kathy. to talk about the tenuous attachments of working class men. It's our pleasure and our honor to have you. Thanks so much.
And looking at Tim's list, I realized I have read and reread every one of those ethnographies except for Seoul. So it's really wonderful to see that list. So we've all sort of noted the decline in labor force participation among working class men and the rise in mortality. And this has led many of us to ask the question, are these trends related? And what can explain them? So lots of folks are in this field, but tonight I want to offer two hypotheses, the second perhaps more unique than the first. So the first hypothesis is that the troubles of such men in part may flow from their increasingly tenuous ties to three key social institutions: work, family, and religion. So that ground has been traveled a little bit by other scholars, but we also want to add a second hypothesis, and I think this is really new ground. We find in our in-depth interviews with 107 of these men that they are not simply passively reacting to changes in the economy, family norms, and religious organizations. Instead, they are actively engaged in renegotiating their relationships to these institutions in a quest to craft autonomous, generative selves. Now, I was going to title this paper, The Autonomous Generous Self. I sent that to Luke Schaefer. He said, people will think you're crazy, change the title. But I'm hoping to sell you on this idea by the end of this talk. And in our exploration of these men's narratives, we really find that this desire for autonomy seems to be rooted in a rejection of the monotony and limited autonomy that their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers experienced at work, plus a new ethos of creativity and self-expression. We also find that generativity, which we define as a desire to guide and nurture the next generation, seems to be rooted in past trauma, sometimes in the family of origin and sometimes out in the world, often related to substance abuse. For these men, giving back not only makes the world a better place for the next generation, something they're passionately interested in, but also is a chance to redeem often painful pasts. In sum, it is not enough to understand that these men have become detached and unmoored from these key institutions. One must also understand that men are remaking, renegotiating, redoing their engagements with work, childbearing, and spirituality in ways that grant them greater autonomy, often with an emphasis on generativity. Now, you might say, why family? Why religion? Well, these are topics Lee Rainwater, institutions he also looked at. But for the working class in the United States, at least, these institutions played a vital role historically in granting the working class economic resources, moral guidance, and opportunities for civic engagement, along with the social bonds and the defined identities that might have encouraged them to stay in the formal labor market and to forestall health problems. Without these attachments, it might weaken the power of these institutions to shepherd and shift men's trajectories and may introduce them to risk. So many of you don't know, perhaps, that I've been studying, along with my colleagues Tim Nelson, Robert Francis, and Andrew Cherlin, all co-authors on this paper, men, for quite some time. And this project drew on a number of in-depth interviews we did with men, half black and half white, in 4 cities between 2000 and 2013. Something key to know about these data is that all of the men in this study are fathers, because we were particularly interested in the role of the family in men's lives. They're also somewhat more disadvantaged than what you would see from a population-based sample of working-class men, because in 2 of this size, we required that each man have at least 1 non-custodial child and thus be eligible for child support. So those are the data I'm going to be drawing from. And as I explicate this story of unmaking and remaking, I'm going to start with the domain of work. So you may be familiar with these 3 classics. Michel Lamont's The Dignity of Working Men, the classic ethnography by Paul Willis from Working Class Britain, and the surveys of Melvin Cohn. All of these publications paint a portrait of the working class in prior generations, drawing identity from hard work at demanding, repetitive tasks, what Lamont calls the disciplined self. Now, we might argue about whether that portrait is accurate, but nonetheless, this is not what we see in our data. Not only do men in our sample draw little identity from the current unskilled and semi-skilled jobs they hold, they are engaging in many cases in an active rejection of the kind of jobs that seem to be able to grant their fathers and grandfathers dignity. So, for example, Barnard, who had earned an HVAC certification 8 years prior but had never managed to find work in the field, currently worked as a security guard. And he told us, I'm doing this just to pay the bills. I'm not really into law enforcement. Now, men are renegotiating their relationships with work in 4 ways. We've all heard about the retreatism, and we do have a couple examples of that. More often, men are hedging their bets. They're seeking certifications in multiple fields to sort of deal with the tenuous nature of their employment. Perhaps more interestingly for social scientists are the relatively large number of men in this sample who are pursuing side bets. Now, these aren't hustles in a traditional sense. They're not quests to earn a little extra money. They're not illegal. They're passions. They're hobbies that men hope to take commercial. And finally, it's fascinating to look at the kinds of jobs these men aspire to hold, which are quite different than the jobs they do hold. So just to give you a little bit of taste of some of the retreatists, this is Rick. He, after high school, but before becoming a father, with a number of friends, took a surfing safari to Mexico and California beaches in a VW van, and he spent 4 years while his wealthy suburban parents were sending him money, engaged in this surfing safari. And he says, I went on a surfing safari. We were totally hipped out, patchouli oil, the whole 9 yards. I actually don't know what patchouli oil is. I assume it's exciting. So he was one example of a retreatist. And Kirk is an interesting case. In his mid-20s, he left work. He moved in with his mother and joined a social club of fellow owners of Pontiac Grand Prix cars. So he tells us, I was just enjoying the time off, hanging with my buddies. Now, interestingly enough, in Kirk's case, pregnancy intervened, and soon he had a job and was saving for an apartment for his girlfriend and the coming child. A similar dynamic occurred with Rick, and in fact, no man of the 107 in our sample was currently pursuing leisure full-time, perhaps because all of them were fathers. Now, as I said, many more were hedging their bets. In response to the tenuous work landscape they faced, men were often seeking multiple certifications, developing skills in multiple areas of expertise. Often, some of these certifications were in things they were passionate about, but others were in things that were simply to pay the bills. So, for example, Iraq vet DeMario told us, I need to have at least 3 options for income, and if one doesn't work out, then I could have the other 2 as a fallback. So consistent with his narrative, after leaving the Army, DeMaria used his veterans' benefits to train as a diesel mechanic, and then as a barber. He is currently working as a barber. He didn't take to diesel mechanics, but he's also just enrolled at a local state university in a visual production certification program, and that represents more of his passion, which is in media. And he's not unwise to do this, as we know from Barnard's story. A certification in one trade is no guarantee of a stable job. But for me as a sociologist, the more interesting material lay in the side bets and in the aspirational jobs. So these side bets, these passions that men hope to take commercial, most commonly were things like DJs, tattoo artists, authors were surprisingly common. Many of us are authors in this room. Jean wrote and self-published a book called The American Infidel. Jean used to work as a PI for a brief stint several years ago, and he followed around cheating spouses, and he thought this was fascinating work. So he then interviewed dozens of other PIs who were also chasing around cheating spouses, and collated the material, maybe much in the way we qualitative social scientists would, and has put together this book that he really sees as a self-help book for people who want to stay married. So he says, I have the complete profile of the American infidel. Everything that's in that profile is everything you need to survive a marriage. Side bets allow men to renegotiate attachments at work. I'm just going to go back up here. In ways that offer greater autonomy. In Jane's case, of course, autonomy is reflected in this very creative task of writing a book and doing these interviews. But we also see that these side bets are highly entrepreneurial. They include catering, everything, in fact, from catering to one man who started a cannabis farm. And there's also sort of an undercurrent in these data of a love for the creative and the performing arts. But beyond autonomy, men are also using side bets to sort of demonstrate their commitment to generativity. So Blake was a forklift operator, but his real passion was his part-time assistant coaching job with an AAU team, something he hoped to make full-time in the future. And the reason he wanted to be a coach was not just that he loved basketball, but it was really to honor the memory of a next-door neighbor in his neighborhood where he was a kid who was a profound mentor, not only for him, but for many of the kids in the neighborhood. He told us a next-door neighbor used to come out and coach the kids in the neighborhood basketball games. He saw something in the guys that I was around, and so he took us all in and pretty much adopted us. And he is the reason that all of us enrolled in college. Now, Barnard, the security guard we mentioned earlier, had a big dream, an aspirational job. He noticed that he is in Boston, and he noticed that in the winter, when it snowed, several of the kids would get out and make some money shoveling sidewalks and driveways. And in the summer, some would cut lawns. And his dream was to get out of the security guard gig and found a company that would organize these kids, get regular customers to sign up, and not only generate money for himself, but a real opportunity for kids to connect to their neighborhood and to glean a feeling that they mattered. So he told us, and then I can employ the kids from the neighborhood. Each kid can have a block, A lot of people, they don't even want to give these kids a chance. But I'm giving them something to work with first. Work for your neighborhood, you know what I'm saying? Now, Larry is my favorite example. Larry was born in Barbados. This is not Larry. Larry was born in Barbados, immigrated to Boston to the Dorchester neighborhood, and when he got there, this neighborhood has quite a few Caribbean immigrants. He noticed that there were very few resources for young people to learn about Caribbean culture and to get a sense of cultural pride. Now, the one seminal event in Boston celebrating Caribbean culture, of course, is the Caribbean American Heritage Festival, which is sort of includes like a Mardi Gras sort of parade with beautiful dancers and other performers. And Larry began to learn to sew costumes for this parade, and in fact was engaged all year long with creating costumes much like the one you see here. This is actually a photo of a performer at that parade. He had really gotten good at this and really wanted to take it commercial, but his vision was actually to start a community center and to teach youth how to create these costumes and other Caribbean handicrafts, and then to sell them. He also envisioned having programming about Caribbean history to instill Caribbean pride. So in the last three slides, I've really talked about a youth emphasis. But there's another emphasis in these data as well, and that is really about saving others. So other common goals were to be a substance abuse counsel or some kind of first responders. So one example of that is Bear. Bear says, dreams of being a firefighter, and he says, not so much for the pay, but because it's self-fulfilling, you know, just to save one baby, to run in and save someone else's child from burning to death. So like Barnard, many fathers talked about the importance of saving others from harm. But they also talked about how in saving others, they could save themselves. We heard many stories of overcoming trauma and substance abuse. John had my pain, the words my pain, tattooed right here across his neck. And when he talked about his commitment to pursuing work with a generative theme, he told us, I don't want my son to experience the pain I went through in childhood of neglect, someone not loving you, not being there. The family. Here again we see themes of unmaking and remaking. We find that many of these men have a relatively low investment in the role of romantic partner or spouse. Now, some of our men were currently and formerly married. More were postponing marriage until the finances were right. A few had eschewed the institution altogether, although this was relatively rare. But there was this theme of withdrawal, of claiming autonomy from the spousal role, and this is in line with marriage trends. After 1980, the proportion of households with kids headed by a married couple declined fairly dramatically among the working class. Now, interestingly enough, even men living in relatively marriage-like relationships, so relationships where you're cohabiting with the partner of your child and your child, often expressed some doubt about the permanency of their relationships. Now, in past work, Tim Nelson and I had seen this among poor men, but these were working class men. So I thought that was quite striking. Commonly, people would say things like, if we're still together in 5 years, then maybe we'll get married. Now, the marrieds were a little more confident about the permanency of their relationships, but they were similarly hesitant to recommend it to others. So Robert is a father of 3. He's one of the few men in the study that goes to church every Sunday, sends his kids to Catholic school. He was raised that way. He got married at 21. He waited till 21 because he wanted to be old enough to drink at his wedding. Fun little detail. But he tells us, I have known so many people that have lived together for years, have kids together, things are great. But then they got married, 6 months later they're divorced. And I think that piece of paper changes the way people act. But while kind of retreating from the strictures of the spousal role, men are simultaneously boldly embracing the father role. And in fact, in these interviews, fatherhood was highly salient for nearly all of the men in the sample. When we asked Fred about parenting his 6-year-old, he told us, it's definitely great being a father. You just have a little person who looks up to you and is trying to emulate some of the stuff you do. A child is someone you can kind of help shape them and form them into a good person. Similarly, Brian told us, to be honest with you, fatherhood has taught me pure love. I knew pure love with my ex-wife, but with my daughter, you don't get anything better than that. You know what I mean? Now, in contrast, men who were separated from the children for various reasons, who were not seeing them, were often emotionally devastated by the experience. Bill had lived with his twin mother for 9 years before they broke up, and she began prohibiting him from seeing the children. He told us she wants to be completely out of their lives. She has completely slammed the door and made sure I cannot do anything about it. It's destroyed me. It has destroyed me. When men talk about their desire to be good fathers and engage in the fathering role, however, the model they have in mind is not the model their own fathers set. Many times they're sharply critical of their fathers for merely providing. This generation is in to nurture and warmth. Brian is an example. He's critical of his father because his father doesn't show emotions. Now, don't get me wrong, he's phenomenal when it comes to supporting his family and doing what needs to be done to take care of his family. He's always done that. But as far as showing emotion, giving us a hug, he just doesn't do that stuff. And then Brian goes on to contrast his own desire to give emotional support in contrast to that of his father. So in sum, for these men, the father-mother relationship is often peripheral and even provisional, while the father-child relationship seems really central to identity. So men are claiming autonomy in the spousal role, but exercising generativity in the father role. But, as I'll caution later, Bill's case shows that this can be highly contingent on a cooperative relationship with the mother. So, what about religion? Very few of our men were members of an established religion and attending regularly. Even those who said vaguely, oh, I'm an Irish Catholic, or I grew up holiness, religion was rarely, at least these traditional established religions were rarely salient for these men. So I love Jeremy's quote in this regard. He says, I treat church just like I treat my girlfriends. I stick around for a while and then I go on to the next one. Now, if you look at trends about church going, you see that as late as 1970, there were no educational differences in church going. But between 1970 and 2010, we see a sharp decline in church going among the working class and only a slight decline in church going among the middle class, leading to a wider gap over time. But again, we see men remaking, renegotiating. And for at least 40% of this sample, faith is highly salient. So Brian tells us he is, quote, religious to a certain point, but I don't know if it's necessarily God or something else. Yet he also says you've got to have faith, because why else would you want to be a human being? Why would you want to have kids or take care of your kids? There's a lot of whys. Some things I've been through in life. There's a reason that I'm here, because I should be dead. Brandon was heavily involved in a Baptist church for 3 years in his early 20s. But I just started hearing a lot of stuff that didn't really sit right with me, so I started researching. And this theme of researching, believe it or not, is all over these interviews. I go to the library and I research religions, right? I go on the internet and I research. I don't identify myself with any organized religion. I believe in spiritual energies. So many of the men in this sample did grow up religious, but stopped going to church when they were old enough to protest, generally in middle childhood or early adolescence. Fascinatingly, even though some of those still identifying with an established religion may deny their basic tenets. So we have Mark, who claims to be a Christian, and he says, I'm not going to say I'm a wholehearted believer. There's something far-fetched about him dying and coming back to life. Now, him is Jesus. And if you know anything about Christianity, that is very much a central tenet of the faith. There's also a very strong mistrust of religious leaders. Many of them are viewed as simply scam artists. Of the Catholic Church in which he was raised, Aaron told us, I mean, it's a beautiful religion. I see some of the stuff they're doing around the world, you know. Here you've got priests drinking out of gold goblets, while in the villages around them, people are starving to death. Probably won't surprise you that some of this arises from the priest abuse scandal. So Greg says, this is a great quote because it just highlights all of the ambivalence around religion and spirituality. I try to mold myself to be like Jesus, even though he may or may not have existed. But when that whole priest thing came out, I became an agnostic. Some had experienced harm in the hands of the church. David was an altar boy. He sang in the church choir, and he told us, something happened to me when I was a kid that set me in a tailspin, so I kind of gave up on all that shit. Oh, Bernard, he's got a great story. So it was February 26th, which happened to be his 26th birthday, which happened to fall on a Sunday, when he heard the voice of God while sitting in church. He tells us, I heard a voice telling me, if you can do better than the holiness faith, then do it. So I turned to Islam, then to Judaism, then to various Christian denominations and sects, Catholic, Pentecostal, and the Baptists, and the Methodists, and the Latter-day Saints, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. Bernard believed that Martin Luther King was a prophet, just like Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad. And currently, he was following a Jehovah's Witness guru who was 95 years old on YouTube. Now, Donald also, like many of our fathers, said he was more spiritual than religious. We'll see how much you know about Christian megachurches. He was a follower, though, of Joel Osteen. Now, if you don't know who Joel Osteen was, you remember there was a megachurch pastor who initially refused to let refugees come into his church in downtown Houston during, I believe it was Hurricane Matthew. So that's Joel Osteen. He believes Joel Osteen is also spiritual and not religious. Osteen would contest this. Donald was raised a Catholic, but he says faith didn't take hold until he landed in Alcoholics Anonymous. He told us, I finally sat down and took an inventory of the spiritual part of my life. Currently, he says the serenity part, a prayer 25 times a day, and he's just purchased a ring with the serenity prayer inscribed on the inside of the band. So for Donald, Donald hated religious people, and you'll see that in the quote, but he was still deeply engaged in spiritual life, grounded in his experiences of addiction and pain. So he tells us, spiritual people have been to hell. Religious people are afraid of hell. People like me who are spiritual have already been to hell and back. You can't scare an addict. You can't scare me. You can't scare me with death. I'm not scared of anything. But it's religious people who are scared of everything. That's why they pray and need Jesus, because they are afraid. So clearly these are do-it-yourself religions. They're highly individualized and subject to frequent negotiation. John believes in the unity of all religions, but especially Christianity. However, recently he's come to believe that it's only by studying the ancient Sumerians that you can get the real story of creation. And he also has come to believe that only by studying the Mayans, the Incas, and the Aztecs, so the specificities of these stories are really fascinating, that one can glean hidden truths that have been cloaked because of technological distractions and authoritarian suppression. He believes there are actually 12 planets and not 9, and this has been known to science for some time. But for some reason, the government doesn't want you to know about it. Greg used to watch a lot of documentaries about religion and read a lot. This included daily meditations from the Dalai Lama, the Book of the Tao, a book on Christian parenting that he found, quote, very helpful. And his religious eclecticism is reflected on the tattoos in his body. So he's got a crucifix on one arm, an elven star, which he calls a pagan symbol, and the Eye of Horus on the other arm. He believes this is the Egyptian god of the sun, but that's not what came up when I Googled this symbol. Now, unlike religious traditions of old, these are not moral creeds. They're not meant to guide behavior, but instead they are quests for knowledge. So Barnard told us being spiritual was part of his quest to be a know-it-all. And Blake said, the older I get, the more well-rounded I want to be. I want to be able to walk in anywhere, any conversation, any topic, and at least know something about it. But these DIY religions can become so specialized that they leave you void of others to discuss and share common beliefs. So Bryant was an adherent of ancient astronaut theories, including during World War II. Of course, these theories are that these ancient astronauts have visited the planet at several periods in history. This is a series he loves that talks about these ancient astronaut theories. But he really regrets the fact that he can't find other people to talk about this with. So, where does this leave us? Well, in case I've sounded too optimistic, I don't usually give optimistic talks. I want to also acknowledge that the autonomous, generous self is also a haphazard self. This is my one effort at animation, so hold on. So in these narratives, vocational aspirations, while laudable, remain nebulous in many cases and only rarely form an explicit strategy. So they are easily replaced by a string of random jobs. Similarly, the transition to parenthood among these men is often by accident rather than design, as we heard the stories of Brandon and DeMario. They're often conceived in tenuous relationships that are provisional. DeMario learned he was a father only after his child was born. Brandon's story is interesting. He was on Facebook one day and he saw a posting from his ex-girlfriend of her 2-year-old twins. He sort of wondered about that. And then he received an email from her sister saying, hey, by the way, you're the father of these babies. Now, both of these men got DNA tests, demanded DNA tests. And in fact, Brandon got DNA tests for both of the twins. So now they're highly engaged in fatherhood. But again, that's contingent upon the relationship with the mother. So religious communities with institutionalized belief systems have been replaced by a patchwork spirituality with few social bonds and holding little sway over behavior. Indeed, that's what these men are looking for, something that does not have sway over their behavior. So, for example, Ed prays to the God of his understanding because the God I learned about in Sunday school was a God with strings telling me how to live. That didn't work for me. So what's the upside of this story? It could be good that men are breaking free from limited autonomy in the workplace and seizing an autonomy once reserved only maybe for middle class or upper middle class men. And indeed, their attitude toward work, this idea you have to have multiple skills and you have to be entrepreneurial and generate side bets, could be ideal for what's coming in the economy. Could also be wonderful that men are freeing themselves from gender-segregated family roles and embracing new definitions of masculinity that connect them more deeply to their children. And we all know that religion, at least Protestant and Catholic religion in the United States, is in a bad moment. And being released from the religious behavioral norms and maybe some of the in-group, out-group attitudes of religion could really put men on a new footing where they're more open to new ideas. So we might want to celebrate the fact that these men are laying claim to a level of autonomy and generativity that they did not have access to in prior generations. But the glass half empty version of this story is that without guardrails, many will falter. You know, my graduate program, my dissertation advisor is here, who's Christopher Jenks. My graduate program back in the day had virtually no requirements. And I just wrote my dissertation and graduated. That's pretty much it. It was interesting that almost none of us made it through back in those days. So for these men, for their grandfathers, these institutions of work, family, and religion created the attachments, the investments, the involvements, the beliefs that guided action and gave meaning. These institutions did so in a patterned manner that was broadly shared within the community and was successfully reproduced over time. These institutions organized social activity into common patterns of behavior, and they supplied the norms, beliefs, rituals that legitimated them. So if the disciplined self has indeed been replaced by the autonomous, generous, yet haphazard self, one might predict that pro-social behaviors would decrease, while counterproductive behaviors would increase. And some would say that's a pretty good read of the evidence. But we faced these kinds of cultural crises before. So many of you who know me know that I love Emile Durkheim. And Emile Durkheim wrote about the transition from organic to mechanical solidarity during the Industrial Revolution. And apparently, some of what we're seeing here must have been going on there, because he wrote, "It has been rightly stated that morality is in the throes of an appalling crisis." But listen to what he says next. "The remedy for the ill is nevertheless not to seek to revive the traditions and practices that are no longer correspond to present-day social conditions. Rather, we need to introduce greater justice into their relationships by diminishing those external inequalities that are the source of our ills." Thank you.
I'm returning just to give a hand with the Q&A. Anyone who wants to ask a question, please head for the microphones. Oh, we're losing some.
Yes, thanks very much for your talk. I'm curious, though, that you omitted political institutions, which seem to me to be the elephant in your talk, if you mind my saying so. And what are your thoughts on this? I mean, one interpretation, and speculating now, is that if an adept demagogue came along, God forbid, by chance, these men would be very susceptible to a skillful political demagogue of a certain type. But be that as it may, how do you see the political side and the political implications of this beyond the family, religion, and so forth? Thank you.
Right. So we did ask about political affiliation and voting, and these questions really fell flat. But of course, this was only as of 2013. But I do have two friends in the field. Jen Silva is writing a book about coal country, and my co-author, Robert Francis, is writing about a small town in eastern Pennsylvania, an industrial town. And they're similarly finding, contrary to, I think, the media account, a great deal of disengagement with politics. And in fact, we know, right, that the largest political party is the party of none. So maybe we need to be thinking a little bit more about why the party of none, even in coal country, this is what dominates Jen Silva's new research. In fact, neither one of these young ethnographers are finding much evidence for people enthusiastically and blindly sort of drinking from this fire hose of political ideology, so that they're out in the field right now. So I think we need a lot more evidence about what's happening in these parts of the country, and perhaps we should be a little more cautious of anecdotal accounts. I won't mention them, but.
Let me just ask that you speakers identify themselves briefly before asking a question, just so we'll know who you are. The first speaker was Don Robotham, an anthropologist here at the Graduate Center.
You didn't talk about the instabilities and dysfunctions in their lives, the length of unemployment and how they coped with that. You seem to dismiss religion, or they seem to dismiss religion, but I understand that these mega churches are support networks for people. You can find jobs through them, you can find housing through them, you can deal with a lot of issues. They're quite active. Was it Eisenberg? The person who wrote A Nickel and Dimed, she said that the mega churches were very important.
Well, so I've spent quite a bit of time in observing these places, but the demographic data do show that church attendance of any kind among the white working class, the working class generally has fallen fairly precipitously. The middle class, the college educated go to church more than those with a high school degree, but without a college degree. So that is really the demographic story. This is not to say that, if we had maybe a sample that was a little disadvantaged in this one, we wouldn't see more adherence to faith. But we thought we would find what you're talking about, and we didn't.
Let's take a question from over here and let us know who you are when you ask your question.
I'm Howard Schwartz, and I teach about inequality at the Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. And I guess the thing I was most curious about, and it comes up in the discussion of the individual seeking in religion, is that there seems to be a lack of community in all of this. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that, because what distinguishes the working class here from the earlier working class is that, that the fact that the working class was in the same place at the same time doing the same things bound them together, even though it was an exploitative environment.
So this is such a great comment. While I was in Philadelphia, one of the many jobs Tim wrote a letter of recommendation for, I spent a lot of time in this white working class neighborhood called Port Richmond. And what's great about Port Richmond is all the homes are exactly the same, right? And they all have these white marble steps. And back in the day, the housewives would be out cleaning the marble steps with Ajax powder. And they would also be sweeping the sidewalks. And so when I was in Port Richmond, I interviewed grandparents, parents, and then children to really understand what was happening with the white working class. And it is really stunning the degree to which community has fallen apart. So there used to be, for example, a church, there were, I think, 9 Catholic churches, either 7 or 9 Catholic churches in Port Richmond. All of these sort of Eastern European groups had their own parishes. Some ethnic groups had more than one parish. There were an equal number of Catholic schools. Most of those churches, and I think all of those schools, have now closed. People are moving away. The community is sort of atrophying. Crime has come in. So, yeah, I think you're exactly right. What we're really, I think maybe the glass half empty, I should have emphasized a little bit more sort of the disappearance of community. In Philadelphia, there's this great place where you go get married, Jumies. I'm looking at Tim here, my co-author and spouse. You used to, if you got a girl pregnant, you'd get a 6-pack and go there, and you'd get married. People don't do that anymore. So there is a sense that the traditions and the sort of the web of things, which, as you said, are both oppressive and supporting, are gone.
Well, is there any indication indication that these men are forming long-term friendships that in the long run can lead to the emergence of community?
No. Except with their children. But we know that, well, I think we've just learned, Sarah, from the Fragile Families 15-year wave that we maybe were a little too pessimistic about whether they would maintain relationships with their children. Half of children at age 9 say, in fragile families, say they feel very close to their fathers. So,
Take a question from over here.
Hi, I'm Talia Wolf. I'm a student here in the sociology department. I hope you all forgive me. I want to actually ask a question that is not directed so specifically at your talk, but about your methods and your experience in the field. With this work, as well as your previous books, you've dealt largely with populations that are relatively underprivileged compared to yourself with regard to class. And I'm wondering about how you negotiate that in the field, and then whether or not you think that has influence on your findings and your data.
yeah, so really important question, right? Unfortunately, the people who become professors also become middle class. Many of us have working class origins, but we become middle class. And we could ask the same question about race. So I think we have to enter into this world of research with great respect and humility. We make it a point to really engage with our respondents while we're doing the analysis and writing, before we publish our work, to try to, we have biases, right, that we're not aware of. I think one thing that's protective is that there's no piece of data that I write about that hasn't been touched and seen by many eyes. So we have a whole research team of other faculty and students from a variety of backgrounds. And if I tell a story on Barnard, someone's going to say, Rachel Butler's going to say, oh, come on, you totally misinterpreted that. That's not what I saw. So, one thing I think I actually reflect of Lee Rainwater's legacy is he was really the first team ethnographer. Behind Get a Walls had a whole team of people in Pruitt-Igoe collecting data, and they really worked together to create these portraits. And so that's what we do. But we are humble and try the best we can to get the folks that we interview to reflect on the data. Yeah, thanks for the question.
I think we have one over here.
Hello, thank you very much. So my name's Kim Spencer Suarez. I'm a grad student in social work, not here, but I'm visiting from uptown. Hi, Irv. So my question is about a sort of a specific point that you mentioned about the research being something that kept coming up in the interviews, and
with regard to religion in particular.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about that, because that's something that I'm interviewing formerly incarcerated fathers about child support debt and how they navigate the system, and there are so many different pathways as far as how they go about seeking information, from whom, and how they make meaning of the process of seeking. So it might be an exercise in self-efficacy that can have a lot of other effects. So not to make any assumptions. So I'm wondering if you could explain a bit more about what that has looked like in in these interviews, how it's functioned, and how it's constructed with, as far as what kinds of meanings it construct around that. Pardon me.
Yeah, great question. So this theme of research, the great thing about the DIY religion is anybody can do it, right? If you're making up your own religion and you feel that it's really up to you, they're not sort of barriers to entry. It doesn't matter. You have to be able to read. And I think the levels of illiteracy in my 30 years of experience among the working class are quite low. at least the non-immigrant working class. So they're reading and that kind of thing. But this idea of being able to sort of formulate an expertise. You get this with the authors too. We've got quite a few people who are self-publishing books. This idea that you can have sort of a know-how, a knowledge that you can sort of take around, and it's a way to have conversations with other people, and it's empowering. I think maybe there's something about religion, and it's the fact that there are so many of them. That allows men sort of greater purchase to sort of claim. It's almost like going to college, it's a DIY college in a way. But men can pursue any interest they want. I mean, the quotes about faith are bizarre, right? I mean, who would have thought? I was first putting this presentation together and I'm thinking, well, people will think I'm crazy. But men are, they're not joking about this. This is deeply meaningful to them. So I think they're really claiming sort of an intellectualism, if you will, in this research. But we should talk about child support too. That's harder to feel that, that child support is not something that gives you feelings of autonomy.
Question over here?
Hi, I'm Don Goldstein. I'm a part-time career advisor here at the Graduate Center. And my question is, what definition do you use of the working class? Is it income related or profession or education level or something else? And how did you choose the men to be included in the study?
Okay, great question. So we're using a super simple definition, high school graduate, but with no four-year degree. So super simple definition. There are a million different definitions we could have chosen. That's the one we chose. What we did to glean the sample is to employ something I developed in my first book with Laura Lane, Making Ends Meet, we called maximum heterogeneity. So we did not sample these men randomly. I have done that in other studies. It's terrific when you can do this. But what we did is we identified working class neighborhoods based on census data. And then we used a variety of techniques, including flyering, getting referrals from community organizations and grassroots groups, but especially street sampling. So at random sampling interviews, we would walk the streets and approach men and try to recruit them into our study. The disadvantages of that is we really can't calculate a response rate. And so I view this work as hypothesis generating, but it was great to be able to really spend hours. Most of the men we interviewed multiple times, so we got to know them more than you would in a casual encounter. We collected detailed life histories. Tim Nelson here, my co-author here, did many of the interviews. Many times the men cried in the context of these interviews, and you're sitting at McDonald's and these big guys are weeping, often about their childhoods or their own relationships with their children. So it is not a random sample. And again, it's more disadvantaged than you would find because of the special parameters in two of our sites.
We have a question over here.
Hi, my name's Matt. I'm a community member. It's a topic that I'm interested in. I'm curious if you've considered the role that automation in our industrial society might play in displacing low and moderate skill labor, and how it may be exacerbating this trend given that men often derive so much identity and respect from the occupations they hold.
My general sense from these interviews and other work I've done is that work is less salient to these men's identities than I don't have comparative data from 30 years ago, but it seems when in reading, I read all of the ethnographies, I think, of working class men in preparation for this talk, and it seems different from the stories we're telling. It doesn't seem as, work in general doesn't seem as salient, but that's speculation. Yes, the discipline itself not only requires a certain kind of attitude, but a certain kind of job, and we know that these jobs have declined pretty dramatically, perhaps due to the rise of the hourglass economy in the mid-1970s. There are other people in this room that are much more expert on that than me. But it is interesting that men are not saying, gee, I wish I had the kind of factory job my dad did. In fact, they're saying, I would never work in that kind of a job. Not all of them, but we're hearing, and that's why that graphic was of that man, sort of, that little stick figure kind of pushing that image away. You know, the idea that you would spend your life in something that was that monotonous and lacking in opportunity is really an anathema to many of these guys. So maybe it wouldn't be if those jobs existed, maybe, we don't know. But it does seem like men are seeking different kind of work. And maybe they're seeking lives that are defined by more than just work.
Question's kind of similar to that. In other words, I was wondering if you had studied the anger quotient, so to speak. In other words, the press in the last 6 or 7 years has been talking about the fact that people feel so disconnected and that they're losing their jobs, they're this and that, the Great Recession. And how does that play off? And what I'm hearing is the only thing that they're engaged with is the children. So is it what they're just drawing back into themselves and kind of forgetting about the rest of the society?
I think that's too dark of a view. I mean, so it's hard for me, and perhaps for some of us in the audience, to really grasp how into being a weekend DJ you can be, and how much joy you can take from creating tattoos or running your own cannabis farm. You know, it's not just, okay, I'll let that go. But it's not as if, you know, human beings are sort of remarkable. You know, my last book with Luke Schaefer, I guess it was a couple books ago, was about, you know, the Americans with the least income. And that was a dark story. This is a much less dark story. So men are engaged in this remaking. And I think we should think about that. Are there ways of capturing that spirit? You know, I'd like to rebuild community, but not the kind of community that demands conformity to a lot of norms and behaviors that are perhaps outmoded, to use Durkheim's sentiments. But I want to think about how we can capture the spirit of this autonomy, this quest for creative self-expression, and this commitment to generativity. How can these be bad things? There must be some way we can capitalize on these to remake our institutions. You know, my own view of this is that our institutions are sort of worn out. Right?
I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I think we can take 2 more questions, and then I'm afraid I have to call it to a close. Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Emma. I'm a history PhD student at NYU. And in your talk, you mentioned kind of changing definitions of masculinity as it relates to children. I know in previous work you've kind of examined how marriage is no longer such an important institution, but that people gain fulfillment from parenthood. But with this masculinity, I'm wondering, is this also translating to these men's relationships with women? I presume all of the subjects are heterosexual. Is it transferring to their relationships with women?
So I go, no. I mean, you've asked a really good question. You know, we spent some time in the Mississippi Delta this summer, and at this nonprofit that's trying to bring the freedom schools back to the Delta. And we were with all these kids, and some former students of ours were leading this freedom school, and they were teaching this sort of black feminist curriculum. I'm thinking, wow, how is this going to go over? And then I began, you know, hanging out with some of these young boys in this little town, and you know, it is really, at least among these kids, this curriculum really confronted these boys, right? In ways that were visceral. were not, what they were seeing in their communities. Similarly, in many of the white working class neighborhoods we've been hanging out with, we were back in Cleveland this summer with many of our working class pals that have been the subjects of former work. And again, this does seem to be sort of a fundamental blind spot.
I think we can take one last question.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Paul. I'm an education research analyst for CUNY, and I'm a student at the GC in the social department. I had a question about, I wanted to know if any of your interviewees ever spoke to you about their fears for their children in terms of, reproducing or class reproduction and having their students maybe not be given some of the opportunities that I'm sure they would want their children to be given in terms of education and having work that would produce higher income. They clearly are very reflective and they talk about emotions. You mentioned one quote, for instance, where one of the respondents talked about giving their child emotions that wasn't given to them by their parents. And so I was just curious to see if they extended that to also think about their children's economic future.
Yeah, absolutely. Stay in school, stay in school, stay in school. It's fun to see the ways in which these guys try to, try in their own way to deal with these overwhelming pressures that are coming from without. Men stopping by the library to read to their kids after school, helping with homework. So there's a lot of that parenting time. Men, beyond nurture and warmth, really try to do what they can to help their kids be successful. But they don't view success merely in economic terms.
Kathy Edin, thank you.